bucka. Haha. You know the deal.
The next thing we're going to talk about in our unit on ratios is called rate. And the first question you're going to want to ask yourself is, what is rate? And for our purposes, we're going to define rate as describing the relationship between two variables that depend on each other. And when I say two variables, I just mean two pieces of information, two pieces of mathematical information that change, and they change in a way that depends on, one depends on the other. And when you're trying to determine rate, usually the first question you ask yourself is, what is the dependent variable? Let's look at an example to explore this a little bit. So the first example we're going to look at is traveling in a car. So while traveling in a car, let's say you go 300 kilometers in 5 hours. So our two variables here, our two pieces of our information, are the distance. Here it's 300 kilometers, and the time. Here the time is 5 hours. So when you're trying to determine what is the dependent variable, you have to ask yourself, what depends on what? So again, in this example, we're dealing with time, and we're dealing with how far we go, distance. And if we think about, well, what depends on what, we would say that the distance that we go depends on how long we've been traveling. In other words, distance depends on time. So let's look at another example and try to find out what depends on what. So in this example, we have 3 cartons of eggs, and those 3 cartons of eggs hold 36 eggs. So the two pieces of information here, the two variables that we have, are the number of eggs and the number of cartons. Well, if we're asking ourselves what depends on what would make the most sense here is the number of eggs depends on the number of cartons. So if you recall, the question we were asking ourselves here is, what is the dependent variable? And we've looked at 2 examples here. So traveling in a car, we go 300 kilometers in 5 hours. Well, if you're traveling in a car, your distance depends on your time. How far you go depends on how long you've been traveling. If we have 3 cartons of eggs, and that holds 36 eggs, the number of eggs you have depends on the number of cartons you have, how many cartons you have. So if we're going to look at this in terms of rate, we're going to solve this using a ratio. And in a ratio, the dependent variable always comes first. So the first part of our sentence here, whatever depends on the other, goes first. So for the first example, distance is the dependent variable because distance depends on time. So for this example, our distance was 300 kilometers. So that's going to go first in our ratio, the dependent variable. And it's 300 kilometers for every 5 hours. The number of hours, the second variable here, is called our independent variable. It's the opposite of dependent. For the second question, the number of eggs is our dependent variable. And here the number of eggs is 36. The dependent variable always goes first in our ratio when we're trying to calculate rate. So it's 36 eggs for every 3 cartons. Now, when we're trying to calculate the rate, what we have to do with the ratio is always make the second value 1. In other words, the independent variable has to change to 1. So for the first question, the independent variable was the time. And in this case, the time was 5 hours or 5. We're going to change that to 1. Well, as we've seen with equivalent ratios, to write equivalent ratios, we do that by either multiplying or dividing. In this case, we're probably going to divide. To change 5 to 1, we divide it by 5. So we have to do the same thing to 300. Divide it by 5. and when we do that, we get 60. So what that means for this example is we go 60 kilometers for every 1 hour. Or the more common way to say that is what we're doing here is we're traveling 60 kilometers per hour. Per means for every one. So when we say 60 kilometers per hour, we're really saying 60 kilometers for every 1 hour, which is what we got in our ratio here. With the second example, again, if we're going to calculate the rate, we're going to make the independent variable 1, the second number in our ratio. And in this case, we're going to do it, again, by dividing, but this time we're dividing by 3 to change 3 to 1. So that's what we have to do to 36, is divide it by 3. And when we do that, we get 12. And what that means is 12 eggs per carton. 12 eggs for every 1 carton. So again, when we're calculating rate, we have to figure out what the dependent variable is. The dependent variable is what depends on the other thing. So for the first example, the distance was the dependent variable because the distance depends on the time. For the second example, the number of eggs was the dependent variable because the number of eggs depends on the number of cartons. That number always goes first in our ratio, and the independent variable is the second piece of information. For our first example, it was time. For a rate, we always have to change that second value to 1, usually by dividing. And when we do that, we have our rate. For the first example, our rate was 60 kilometers for every 1 hour. For the second example, it was 12 eggs for every 1 carton. So to finish off our introduction to rate, I want you to answer a couple of questions here. So for each one of these examples, I want you to do a couple of things. First thing I want you to do is determine what the dependent variable is. And I want you to do that by filling in the blanks. So for each one, blank depends on blank. So for each question, we have 2 pieces of information here. And the second question I want you to answer for each one is, what is the rate? In other words, write it as a ratio and reduce the second value, the independent variable, to 1. So the first one, you get 48 bread rolls in 6 bags. So our 2 pieces of information here are the number of bread rolls and the number of bags. You have to figure out which is the dependent and which is the independent variable. For the second one, you get paid $36 for 3 hours of work. So your amount of pay and the amount of time are the 2 variables there. And the third one, a rocket travels 1,200 kilometers in 4 hours. The 2 variables there are distance and time. So fill in the blank of what depends on what for each one, and then using ratios, determine the rate for each one of these 3 examples. If you're able to do that, congratulations, you now have a firm understanding of an introduction to rate.